Welcome to a Modern Nonprofit podcast, powered by the Charity CFO, your compass for creative solutions in running your nonprofit. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host and guide through this nonprofit maze. From fundraising to volunteer management, we've got your back. Join us each episode for fresh, game-changing strategies that can make a real impact. Nonprofit leaders, welcome back to another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. I'm Tosha Anderson. I'm your host, and today I want to talk a little bit more about scaling, nonprofits. I work with a lot of organizations, or I've ran into a lot of organizations that are looking to scale, looking to grow. Maybe you've been around for a while and it's time to take it to the next level, or maybe you're still brand new and you're just trying to get going. But I'm not here to share all of the words of wisdom. I brought along Sarah Silvestri. She is with, another founder. I love Sarah talking with other co-founders. You founded an organization called Executive Arm, and that's exactly what you do. You help nonprofit organizations that are looking to scale. So I'm thrilled to talk about this conversation today. I know there's so many leaders out there that are struggling in this space and not knowing what the next step should be. So thank you first for joining us, and looking forward to hearing.
Yeah, I'm really excited to join and really appreciate the opportunity. And I'm looking forward to kind of talk about what we do at Executive Arm, and scaling nonprofits is really where our jam is, honestly. It's the area where, everyone has the biggest questions, but honestly, you also meet the biggest creatives. And I think that's the most opportunity that I love in this field, is really getting to meet people and see, what creativity is out there and really what people want to do for the greater good in the world. Because in nonprofits, that's kind of where you meet people who are just dreamers, and
yes,
it's unbelievable.
That's definitely why I fell in love with this industry. That's for sure. And I especially love having these conversations because, I fell in love with the nonprofit industry many, many, many years ago for the creativity and the passion. But I have a special place in my heart now for founders and, the nonprofit entrepreneur, being an entrepreneur myself and growing an organization from, just me as a solopreneur and a cheap laptop to, a full-on national operation with 50 employees now. And it's no small undertaking. And if nothing else, maybe this conversation will be some words of wisdom on next step, but also maybe some validation for the struggle, the struggle of the hustle. That's for sure. So, Sarah, in your work, what do you see are some of the biggest, challenges that nonprofits have with scaling in your work? What are you seeing right now?
Yeah, so I would say really the inception of Executive Arm came from the fact that I worked in nonprofits for over 15 years in a lot of different capacities, whether it was development, operational, management, lower management. I mean, I started really on a volunteer level when I was very young, and it grew from there, and my passion grew from there. But I would say the area that really is the hardest in terms of scaling is really in nonprofits. Everybody is in it, for the good of the world, and they're doing something to accomplish the greater good. But the reality is a nonprofit is a business. And when it comes to the business aspects of a nonprofit, that's where it's challenging, right? How do you create a proper budget? How do you make sure that your budget is really encompassing your needs? Because you want the money that you're raising to go to, the field or the purpose that you're raising it for. But at the same time, a portion of it has to go to support your back end so that you can create the magic. And that's a really hard concept for most nonprofit creatives, I like to call them, or founders, because that's not really where your passion is. Your passion isn't like, let's keep the lights on, right? Your passion is like, there's something greater in this world that we need to fix, or we want to bolster, or we want, to support. And making sure that you're aligned in the sense of that you're implementing the best business practices in order so that you can scale properly is really the first step. And sometimes that's even the people who are sitting in the seat of creating the nonprofits are not necessarily the ones that have the ability to create those practices. And it's really seeking that help if you don't have that background, or, really doing research and reaching out to your network to figure out, what is it I'm missing, and how can I make sure I have a strategic, plan in place that my nonprofit is going to be able to scale? Because scaling is amazing, but if you don't have the things in place to properly scale, it will crumble pretty quickly.
Yeah. Absolutely. I was just kind of thinking as you were talking about it, and this is such a bizarre like a comparison, but I think about, so many founders that I meet that start nonprofit organizations. It's so much harder than they had anticipated. I've never met an organization that was founded by someone that said that was easier than I thought it was going to be, said no one ever, right?
Right.
And it just kind of made me think, it's like, that's what I thought about parenting too, like I have a 9-year-old daughter and it's like starting this business I knew was going to be hard. I don't think anything can quite prepare you for it. You can read all the books, you can watch all the videos, you can talk to all of the people, and nothing quite prepares you for it. And it's always harder than I think what people realize. And you bring up a good point too, because I think that so many people start organizations with the passion for the cause and for the hope to make the difference, right? Not realizing that there's the whole other dimension that's actually running the business from, you know, just there's so many more things that you realize to run a business. And I would add that nonprofits running that business is so much freaking harder than a normal business. It's funny, I used to have people say, Tasha, did you ever consider starting your firm, the Charity CFO, as a nonprofit? And I thought, are you kidding me? No way, because then I
Yeah.
have to find a board, I have to keep them engaged, I have to supplement funding that I would earn with fundraising. And then you have all of the compliance and the registrations and like all of the things that, somebody that just goes and starts a business are not necessarily subject to. So it's so much harder than what people realize. So
No, you're hitting the nail on the head. Essentially, I think, it teaches you to be humble, right? Because I find
mm,
that when you enter the nonprofit sector, there are people that know better because they've been in it longer, and really
mm,
hearing people and understanding what goes into it, and also understanding
mhm,
that it's not going to happen overnight. And I think with
right.
scaling, that's really the hardest thing for nonprofits is when you have a vision and you have a plan, and even if your strategic plan is 1, 3, 5 years, um,
Mhm,
and it doesn't happen in the time frame that you want, doesn't mean that you're a failure. It just means that, there are items that you didn't account for, because when you go into a nonprofit, like you said, there are all these external factors. Like when you have a board and you have 5 other people giving you their opinions or their direction or their expertise,
mhm,
you have that to weigh through all that information and to
right.
really make sure you're fulfilling your goals that you originally set out when you created that nonprofit. It's intense and it takes a lot of time and energy. And honestly, it's not the creative part of the business. Like it's not that passion part, right? It's
Right. Right.
logistics aren't fun, right? Always, and
Right.
they're not necessarily easy. And it's making sure that you can manage that, but still keep that drive and creativity going, and not losing, what your true purpose is in the business or the nonprofit, because
Mm,
it's very easy to be deterred when you have other people's opinions and expertise giving you direction that maybe you didn't see, and
sure.
be able to wade through all that information and really understanding like what's true to your vision versus maybe your vision wasn't the whole scope of what you really needed to see, and
Right.
how turns do you make that won't necessarily change, the authenticity of what you set out to do. So it's hard. It's really hard. And like you said, in parenting, you go into something in the nonprofit field and you really think you know what you're doing. And I think the thing that I learned through parenting with my kids is that you have no clue what you're doing. You're
You have no
really
clue.
trying to survive.
Right.
In certain scenarios, and you're hoping that you're choosing the right thing and directing the right path, but at the same time, until the outcome, you have no clue what it's going
Right.
to be.
Right.
And it's a really good tool in your toolbox in the nonprofit sector to know that like you're not truly in control of what the end result is, even if you think you are, and having the
Hmm.
wherewithal to just be flexible, but also sticking to your guns in terms of like what your purpose and vision was and
Sure.
reassessing your goals. I find that to be one of the main things that we do for nonprofits is really reassessing people's goals and making sure that they're measurable and that
Mm,
you set out to do is actually aspirational and not necessarily, a short-term goal that's not necessarily going to drive you in the right direction. So
mhm.
I think there's so much that goes into it and it's so complex. And I always feel blessed, honestly, to meet different creative nonprofit leaders, because they really give you the drive to want to do better in this world.
Mhm.
And they're just so passionate that sometimes it's so refreshing because you don't necessarily
Right.
get regular business, right?
Right.
And yeah, I think having both ends of it, and I think if Tiff was here, she would be able to kind of play that. But in executive arm, that's really what we had. Like Tiff was the, creative, and I'm more of the logistics and
Mhm.
budgeting and numbers person. And that really plays really well for our business because we both have different strengths and skill sets. And I always say for nonprofit leaders or founders that don't have necessarily a partner, always good
Mhm.
to have like an outside person who you can acquiesce, your feelings and your thoughts to, that you respect,
Sure.
and that has the right, vision in terms of they're aligned with your vision, so that they can
Mhm.
give you really that feedback, because it's so important to have somebody that's truly in your corner.
Well, you're talking about something that I think a lot of people don't realize that they will experience is the loneliness that comes from starting a business. Again, I can certainly relate to that. I want to go, I want to touch on something that I'm curious from your perspective. Um, I find that a lot of people start businesses, again, kind of for-profit, nonprofit, but I think this is especially important for nonprofits, without thinking about the long-term plan of the organization. And let's go back to like scaling, right?
Sure.
Scaling could be, we're going to go from this grassroots organization to a national. Scaling could also mean creating a succession plan and, lifting up the founder into either a paid position or the plan to hire your first executive director. And I've seen a lot of cases for very, very small startup nonprofits that I don't think founders think about that when they start the organization. Because in almost all cases, I think that I've seen at least, nonprofits are created under a model of perpetuity, right? I mean, that's kind of how they're incorporated typically, not always. You can certainly have a specific timeline there, but they're all created in perpetuity. But I don't know if there's actually a plan to, figure out how that's going to work. And what do I mean by that? I've seen organizations that are run by founders that have almost had a all-consuming hobby, for lack of a better word, where they're
Sure.
not getting paid, they're working a full-time equivalent job or more, and because they're not getting paid by that role, they're also having to work full-time somewhere else oftentimes, or even worse, and they're draining all of their resources to finance this operation and things like that. And I think all founders of all businesses should typically consider this. Now, I know in the for-profit world, people usually have this idea, either they don't come up with a plan and they're just going to work, a lot of practitioners and things until they decide to retire, and then they just kind of close the doors and shut everything down. Other founders, plan on, selling the business, growing it to the point that it's sellable, right? Others look for succession plans as they evolve the business, right? And they identify talent and put them in leadership roles and that sort of thing. And so I find that people that start nonprofits, they're not always thinking about this thing is legally a structure that's designed to operate in perpetuity. And so what does that look like? What obligation do I have as the founder to make sure that the organization is scaled to the point where that can actually be true? What do you see in your world? Like, is this something that you've worked with your founders on? And
Yeah, so I would say we really mostly work with small to mid-sized nonprofits for
yeah.
the reason, because they didn't envision the structural aspects of the nonprofit, and they're dreamers. So they thought like I could do everything and I could do it on my own. And really, when that reality comes crashing down, like you said, they're draining their resources or they're working two jobs just to run their nonprofit. They realize it's just not feasible, and that they have to
Mhm.
start putting actual business structures in place to ensure that, they have the support and that their business can, have exist, continue to exist.
Right.
And I think the other thing is Some of them realize they might have had this great idea, but it's actually not feasible to continue in perpetuity, right? It really was more of, there was a period of time that it was, it was needed in the world, and now it has evolved to something different that's necessary. And that's really hard for a founder who really has that passion and, really feels it, like feels every. And so I would say what I see the most of is really a lack of a strategic plan. Like I would say most nonprofit founders have their first 1 to 3 years pretty
Like a
much,
business plan.
right, a business plan planned out. And I would say generally, that doesn't necessarily mean they have every aspect of the business planned out, but really generally
Sure.
they have a vision, they have goals, they have somewhat of a budget depending on the scope of the nonprofit and how large it is. But the areas where they don't have thought process or things in place are, like you said, scaling. Once they need to hire somebody, creating job descriptions, what does that look like? How does their position evolve once they bring on new people? And now they're not only managing the nonprofit, they're managing staff. And having 50 employees, like when you have staff, it's so helpful, but there are so many other areas that now become added to your plate, right? You have to have an HR situation, benefits, payroll. I mean, taxes. I mean, you have so many more elements that you didn't have when it was just you, that all of a sudden you're really doing more of the business end of things. And that's not really what your purpose, like what your idea was. So then really considering, okay, maybe I need to hire a CEO or a CFO to take over those business aspects so I can go back to my passion. And how does it happen? And those type of strategic structures are really not in place for most small nonprofits because they're visionaries. And they think like it's gonna work out because I'm giving my blood, sweat, and tears to it. But really when it comes to those different decisions and different paths that your nonprofit can take, that's really usually what I see in terms of needs. That being said, that's kind of where we come in. And that's, I and Tiff I worked in a nonprofit as an executive, as an executive director, and Tiff was part of the nonprofit because her husband worked in a different role. And she saw like in this nonprofit that like exactly what we're talking about in terms of like, there was great vision and the people behind it were so passionate and had the greatest intent, but the execution was so poor because they didn't have the structures in place to execute, right? They had 2 staff doing 6 people's jobs, and people were disgruntled, and the lack of teamwork and was honestly inevitable because when you put someone in a position where they're the head of HR, they're the head of payroll, they're the head of finance, and they're doing marketing, and like it's an impossibility. No one has all those talents, and you're going to have disgruntled people. So that's also another huge part of scaling is really deciding where you're going to put your main focus on and where the are, making sure that that person is being, if you onboard employees, that vision is fair and that you're ensuring that they're being taken care of because your nonprofit is as good as the people that work for you and their passion. And if they don't feel the passion or they're not bought in the same way, no one's ever going to be bought in the same way you're bought in because you're the founder and you're the visionary. But if your employees don't have that a little bit of a passion and at least feel somewhat of ownership towards the nonprofit, it's never going to flourish the way you want it to flourish. And that environmental piece, I think, is also a huge area where most nonprofits do not put enough focus on. Because most people working in nonprofits, they're not making the same salary as somebody working in a profit business, right? So from the start, they're in a different position financially, and that makes a difference. And if you want really high quality employees, you have to really take care of them and make them feel like, they're part of the family, so to speak, but also make sure that they're the proper things in place, that they're protected in ways like that there's an employee handbook. Like when you have an employee, things shift, and making sure that you're taking care of them as much as you're taking care of your nonprofit and yourself. So
absolutely. Yeah. You bring up an interesting point that I don't think also a lot of founders realize, this idea that you get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? For sure. And I think when you bring on your first few employees, you have to create positions that are, I think, really well defined, right? And I find that that's typically more on the service side or the programmatic side, because you know what those things are. You probably have a pretty good process because that's where most of the energy has been focused. And that creates a weird position for the founder that probably started the organization because they were passionate about the program.
Right.
And it's very difficult to find kind of a Swiss Army knife that you can throw into the mix while you, the founder, go off and continue doing the programmatic work that you love. The reality is that I have found that most entrepreneurs are essentially forced to move out of the thing they love the most and into the fuzzy gray mass of all of other duties as assigned, and you have to keep making sense of these things, and then you bring on another employee, and then maybe you can shift that over. And that's where I find a lot of founders shift their responsibilities to fundraising or a lot of the administrative work. And I think that's where burnout for founders happen, simply because they're doing the work that they don't really love. But it's probably not really going to work any other way. If you try to bring in a staff person and just say, I'm going to go focus on programmatic stuff, and you just like deal with all of these other things, because you're right, Sarah, good luck finding someone that's skilled in that. And let's be honest, if we have founders listening like, Tasha, I'm not skilled in that either. Yeah, me neither. Right. But this is our kind of baby. This is our passion. No one else is really going to have the passion for it. We're probably willing to put up with a lot more chaos and anxiety and confusion around some of these things than any employee that you're going to be able to find. That's just the hard reality I found.
100%. And also the reality is maybe for the first 2 years when you're onboarding your first couple employees, yeah, you're doing more of the back end work and not where your passion lies. But when you grow it to a point where you can financially sustain a high level CEO, that's where you can then transition some of that load off and you can go back to the
Right.
projects.
Exactly.
I think being a founder is also accepting you're not going to be every year in the exact place you want to be. There's always
Yeah.
some areas where you're forced to be because, like you said, you have the passion and you have the drive, and so you're not going to just give up because you're doing something you don't love. On the other hand, an employee who's not being cared for properly is going to leave because they're an employee. Comes down to at the end of the
Right.
day. Even if they have the most passion, even if they're the most loyal employee, if they're not happy in what they're doing, they're an employee. There's a million other places they can work.
Right.
And I
Right.
think it's having that reality of, and that's where the strategic plan comes in, right? Because if you can map out, okay, so for the first 2 years, you're doing it on your own. And then year 3, you're bringing X amount of employees and your role is going to shift because, like you said, the service industry where you're supporting, you know exactly what needs to be done. It's very clear cut. So you can hire people who have those expertise. And the back end stuff that grows and the management and the business side of things, year 3 and 4 is probably where you're going to be focusing the most. And by year 5 and 6, you might have, a lot more availability to hire a CEO if you're financially scaling properly. And that's also, making the hardest part of nonprofits is making sure that where you're putting your money, it's where it's best spent. And sometimes I find when we created an executive arm, the one thing I really notice is because we're an outside contractor and we're coming in and we don't have the same emotional attachment, it's much easier for us to say, let's see your budget and where are you putting your money and where's your focus? And for me to question, like, why? Like, because I don't have that emotional attachment, right? It's not my baby. So I can say to you, this might not be the best way to go if you want to be in 6 years here.
Right.
Maybe you need to move that money to focus on different areas, and whether it's PR marketing, whether it's, adding fundraising dollars so you can get to the point where you can go back to the passion and what you really want to do. And that's hard, when you have a small nonprofit and you feel like someone's questioning your passion. It's really hard and it's not always easy. And I find in nonprofits, the best advice I could give founders is always that if you can listen to advice without internalizing everything, then you're going to see success. But if you can't walk away from advice and you really feel like you internalize it to the point where like you define yourself with it, then not in the right fields. Because in the nonprofit sector, I say this like to every founder, everyone's going to tell you what you've done wrong. That's
Right.
just the
Right. Or what you
reality.
should be doing. Yeah, for sure.
Correct. But the reality is, what they're not telling you is all the things you're doing right. And you need to have that
Mm,
really self-confidence, knowing that you're doing the right things and having, your network of people and the people you trust and your internal circle. Cause I feel that's really important, really having
mhm.
a network of people that you can vent to, or they can, really applaud your successes, because you're not necessarily going to have that from your board once you have a board, or from your employees.
Right. Right.
As they're looking, to grow, and they're probably going to give you more of the negative feedback than the positive feedback.
Certainly. And, you had mentioned when you go in and work for nonprofit organizations that, you'll start asking questions or looking at the budget and, kind of realize maybe you should consider this angle or this angle. When someone's thinking about scaling, let's just kind of use the example of maybe like one, the founder, maybe a couple part-time employees, something like this, like, all right, we really need this to be a sustainable organization. What are some of the top things that you're going to advise your founder to be paying attention to? Like what are like the top few things that like look that all of it needs attention, but these are the things we need to really prioritize. What are some of those things?
Yeah, so I would say the top two things that come to mind initially is really your fundraising and your
Mm,
relationship building. Like, how much focus are you really putting on that?
mm,
Because with nonprofits, that's where your bread and butter is, right? The more people you have financially supporting your nonprofit, the more ability you have
sure.
to, you know, expand, or, really create more passion projects within your project,
Mm-hmm.
within your nonprofit. And I think not enough people realize that your funders or your donors are essentially like, it's like a relationship, right? You're
Sure.
kind of dating them, and you're getting to know them, and you're bringing in them into your fold. But that takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy, and it has to be authentic, and it can't be
Mm-hmm.
transactional. And I think nowadays it's so easy for people to get people to donate transactionally, whether it's through crowdfunding campaigns or it's
True.
through, one-off phone calls. Like, it's very easy to do that, but those aren't your true donors. They're not the people who believe in you, and they're not going to
Mm-hmm.
give you back every year. And I think that area is one area where I tell a lot of nonprofit leaders that needs to be your focus, even if you don't feel like
Mm,
getting to do what you want to do. If you don't have the people behind you or the financial support behind you, you don't have a nonprofit. So
mm-hmm.
that would be number one. And number two would really be looking at your business practices in terms of, like, how are you budgeting,
Mm,
and how are you coming up with a budget, and how are you estimating your budget, like kind of the best practices of budgeting, and going through the process of, like, why did you decide to go this direction? And
mm-hmm.
how are you budgeting for inflation, and how are you budgeting for the fact that, you're going to have to onboard an employee eventually that you're going to have to give benefits to, and those type of things,
Mm-hmm.
really looking into budgeting, and even honestly getting into the back end of really looking at your financial stability and what you need to be a success. Like doing a forecast budget for a projected budget for 5 years is something I also really suggest most nonprofits
Mm,
do. Especially within in the economic scope we're in,
right.
people are givers. Like,
Sure.
really, most nonprofits, people want to give to. It's not that they don't want to give to it, they just don't have the means, or they
Right.
don't, you're not their top five, right? And that's really important. Knowing what makes people tick, especially your donors, is
Mm-hmm.
so important, because every conversation and every relationship you're going to have with your donors is going to be different based on who they are and why they want to be part of your vision and
Mm-hmm.
your passion. And I think, um, also, another thing I tell people, and it's not always the easiest thing, is really self-reflecting.
Mm,
At the end of every year, going through the process of, like, what you accomplished, what your goals were, how you accomplished them. If you didn't accomplish them, why not? What was
mm-hmm.
feedback? What are things that you didn't think about? And then going back to your strategic plan that you set out and really seeing if things need to be adjusted. I think
Mm-hmm.
that self-reflection process is so important. I'm not sure everybody really has the wherewithal to do it, because it's tough. It's really tough to look at yourself and say, like, what did I do wrong?
Right.
How do I fix it?
Right.
And making sure that like you still want to be in this. And I think that's something that a lot of people, um, once they get into the nitty-gritty of a nonprofit and running a nonprofit, I'm not sure they want to be in it still.
Right. Right.
And really that self-reflection at the end of every year, deciding like, am I still in this for the right reasons? Do I
Right.
still want to continue to do this? Am I fulfilling what I set out to fulfill? And is my plan really meeting those goals, and what needs to be adjusted? And how do I adjust my expectations? And
Yeah.
that's also something that I find, different nonprofit founders have different, you know, reality checks or scope of really knowing, like, you know, maybe what I thought was needed wasn't necessarily needed, or maybe there's another organization that's fulfilling what I'm fulfilling, and maybe I need to, you know, join forces, or I need to shift where I was, you know, putting my focus, and decide, you know, what needs to change. And that's hard. That's very hard. I mean, in your personal life, that's hard. So in your nonprofit, it's even harder, because you're really put your blood, sweat, and tears in it, and you believe in it. And sometimes you have to come to these hard conclusions that maybe what you're doing is not really accomplishing what you set out to do.
Well, and then you have the added complexity of, you know, what you're doing is also impacting other people. And so even on a personal, I'd say, oh, if I don't want to do this anymore, I can just make that decision and it only affects me or a few people. But when it's on a larger scale, it's much harder. You know, Sarah, you brought up some stuff that really kind of gave me a, you know, a throwback in my life. I remember when I started this firm 8 years ago, I hired a business coach, and similar thoughts I was given, and I have a completely different business. But he, just to kind of paraphrase and say it differently, kind of in this more like hustle entrepreneur kind of cutthroat environment. That's kind of the coach, you know, he is. But it was similar advice in the sense that kind of my takeaway, my paraphrasing, is that always focus on sales, no matter what. Or in this case, fundraising. Always. It's you as an entrepreneur, you are no longer fill in the blank, whatever you thought you were. You are now head of sales or head of fundraising. And I would say the same thing is true for, you know, anybody leading an organization. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you that. I was a CPA. I was a director of finance, you know, at a nonprofit organization. I was an auditor before that. If anyone ever told me I was going to be in sales, I would think you've lost your mind, right? I started a private practice. I thought, I'm just going to work with a couple of nonprofit organizations. It's going to be great. And then when I was slapped in the face with the reality of, if you want this a sustainable business for you, for your family, for the employees now that you're hiring, for the organizations that rely on your services, et cetera, you have to focus on sales. Because if you're not consistently bringing in new revenue or introducing your business concept to other people or donors in this case, then it will eventually start to dwindle. That's just the fact. So that was a hard truth. And you kind of mentioned that, you know, focus on fundraising, focus on those relationships. So I echo that. Another thing you mentioned is really kind of like around budgeting and finance. And I'm the finance person. I have lots of conversations with people and I hear it all the time. I'm not a numbers person. I'm not an accountant. I'm not this. I'm not that. Another really hard reality is that if you are a business owner, you are not only a salesperson, you are now a numbers person. You have to be a numbers person. What do I mean by that? You have to, even if you are lucky enough eventually to grow to have a CFO, you have an obligation and a responsibility, not just to the IRS says this, or the state says this, or the feds say this, or whoever, your funders say this, but like also to your own self and the sustainability of the organization to understand your numbers. I'm not asking you to be able to explain debits and credits, but you have a responsibility to understand your financial plan to keeping this operation going. That is not something, and I talk about this a lot, like this is not something you can delegate. Like I know so many people that own businesses that come from trades or otherwise, you know, even the woman that does my hair, like she has a business, she runs a business, she has to manage the finances for that, right? So the nonprofits are not unique in that sense, that they have to know the money coming in, the money going out, how to put a budget together, what does that translate into what shows up in the bank account? Are we going to have enough money to pay our bills? So that is another hard reality. You must know your numbers. That was something my business coach said. So you're a salesperson, you are, you know, you're not immune from knowing your numbers. You need to always know your numbers. Now, like I said, I'm an accountant, so I have that advantage, I suppose, but I'm lacking a lot of other things, y'all, that I've had to learn. That's for sure. And so I think these are really key lessons that I had to learn and accept way back when. And I think that's the same. It's the true for any entrepreneur, regardless of what your tax status is. Those things have to be true.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I completely am aligned. I think every job is a sales job when it comes down to it. Like if you think about lawyers and doctors and teachers, ultimately you have a customer service base. That's
Right.
the reality. And
Mm-hmm.
you're always hustling and selling something. It's just it's just the form it takes is different. And I think that's really
Yeah.
hard for people because that vulnerability to be in a sales position is difficult where you're putting yourself out there constantly and you're
Mm-hmm.
going to get rejected. And knowing
Mm-hmm.
how to deal with rejection and take, hearing the feedback and really understanding, what to take and what not to take. And as you said, knowing your numbers. I cannot tell you how many times I'll sit on a conversation with a factor and I'll ask, what's your budget for the year? And like the blank stares I get. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, how do you
Right.
not? Like kind of be the number you definitely know, or like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you figure out what an amount of money you need year to year? Like, what's your
Right.
percentage of growth in terms of financially, you know, yes, you want to double in size, but what does that mean
What
financially?
does that mean? Mm-hmm.
And really doing that deep dive is really difficult for people who really, that's not why they got into the nonprofit sector.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so those are honestly two really good elements of advice. And in all honesty, I think knowing your strengths and weaknesses. Like maybe you're not a numbers person, but you know somebody who is that can really
Mm-hmm.
guide you, or you hire a coach or you hire an accountant
Right.
to really guide you in terms of setting up your nonprofit. And I think um now being in this outsourcing firm where I'm really seeing like a lot of the back end stuff of nonprofits who've been in existence for 5, 10, 15 years
Mm-hmm.
without budgets, without knowing
Mm-hmm.
their numbers and like being kind of baffled how they've survived. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really because they have the passion, right? And that you can never replace that passion, but in order to be truly successful, you have to have a better scope of in terms of your revenue and in terms of your donor relationships. Like you said, you're a salesperson no matter what, in whatever position you are. And if you think of any position in this world or any entrepreneur, you can find a sales element to it.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked a lot about, managing the administrative side, the programmatic side. I'm curious, we've talked about burnout. Is this still the right thing for me? All of these things I hear all the time. How do you see or advise your clients in striking that balance between the mission and the work that you set out to do and all of the other things that need to be done with the end goal of a sustainable business at the end of the day?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing is really creating a plan. That's usually what I
Create a
start with.
plan.
Create a
Mm-hmm.
plan, even if it's, your first draft of what you think it looks like and what your vision is, making sure there's an actual plan. And the second thing is creating a business strategic plan, which is different than a business plan and it's different than, your vision, but really having the strategy behind it and how you're executing it written
Mm-hmm.
out very clear before you even start your nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
That's not so easy, right? Everyone likes to say it's so easy to start a business. It's so easy to start a nonprofit, but if you do it right, there is so much work prior to even starting that nonprofit or business, walking
Mm-hmm.
into it and knowing it might be 6 to 8 months before you could even incorporate or become a 501(c)(3), whatever it is. It takes a lot of effort and brain power and thought and also utilizing your network. And I keep saying this, but everybody has an accountant, a lawyer, a doctor, whatever
Mm-hmm.
in their family, in their friends, in their network of people, or 2 degrees connected to somebody, and really
Mm-hmm.
finding people you trust that you can rely on for advice and learning. You are going to become a student, whether it's a student in
Mm-hmm.
finance, whether it's student in taxes, whether it's a student in nonprofit business ethics, whatever it might be, really putting your head down and learning from people is so important. And really making sure that those pieces are in place before you open the doors and you start to, pitch things to donors. And also, in all honesty, before you really take off on the ground, you need to have a base of people who are going to support you. Making sure you
Financially.
find those supporters prior to launching big.
Mm-hmm.
You have the greatest idea, but if you don't have the financial piece and the business piece in place and the supporters, your idea is going to go nowhere.
Here's where I feel like I could never be a founder of a nonprofit about fill in the blank of something I'm super passionate about. And I think this is what's so unsettling for people when they start nonprofits, that it's very, pick any mission, right? It's hard to argue that this is not important usually, right? Like, let's say it's an organization to, support abused animals or something, right?
Sure.
I think what's so difficult is, starting a mission like this, there's no question that this is a good cause. There's no question people should be outraged by this. There's no question that, hopefully most, if not all people would agree this is like a terrible thing and we need to do something about it. But when that doesn't translate to people financially supporting you, for me, I don't think I could ever emotionally handle that. It's like, y'all know this is important. Why are you not contributing to the cause? But I think I would probably have gone into an environment like, of course, this is going to work. Like, this is outrageous. Of course, people are going to want to join forces and help me solve this. But how it actually shows up in philanthropy when there's so much noise to cut through and to get the attention of people to actually give, that's where I think things, for lack of a better word, like fail to launch in the way that founders think they will. And it's so much harder to get enough people to contribute in a significant enough way over a sustained period of time and continue to add and add and add to that donor base. I mean, I think that's the hardest part. At least it would be for me.
I hear you. I think a lot of talk goes around like giving and charity and how people give nowadays. And I think there's some realities to it. And kind of like a prior what I was speaking about knowing your donorship and knowing where their passions lie. You might have a most amazing project or passion and you want to help and everybody does want to be part of it, but there's limitations to people's resources. And if it's not their top 5 purposes or passions, they're probably not going to give to you significantly. People give differently nowadays than 30, 40 years ago, right? 30, 40 years ago, it was easier to get larger donations just by pulling heartstrings and really getting people to sit down and have a conversation with you and seeing when they saw your passion, they wanted to give to you. Nowadays, people want to give to certain things because they feel passionate about it. Everyone's a giver, but everyone's also in their minds a founder. And it's really, finding that balance between their passion and your vision and where you can align to make sure that you're still executing your goal and your vision, but you're also taking their passion along with you in order to ensure that you have the proper donorship. And you're right, there's a lot of negative letdown being in a nonprofit, which is why it's so important. And I tell this, I probably have this conversation daily with most of my clients, is you cannot take things personally. Just people don't want to support your passion doesn't mean they don't want to support you.
Right.
Your passion are not the same. And it's really important to be able to have distinctions. And that's why I tell a lot of my nonprofit leaders that it's important that they volunteer in a capacity in a different nonprofit that they're passionate about, or they're not driving the bus. Because they can make sure that they're getting some of that positive feedback by not being the driver of the bus. Because it's so easy to drive the bus and never get that positive feedback. But when you're volunteering for an organization and doing good, you're only going to receive that positive applause. And therefore, it really changes your perspective. It also really gives you the ability to make sure that your life doesn't revolve around one thing and one path. We're
It's easy to
consuming
do.
Yeah, and
It's
it
easy to
not
do.
only is it easy, but it's, I think, and I'm gonna bring us back to parenting, because I think it's where I learned the most lessons. I remember before I had children, one of my good friends who had kids before me said to me, just remember that you're still you and that you have
Mm,
parts of you outside of the fact that you're becoming a mother. And at that point I was like, oh, I don't know. You don't know what you're talking about.
mhm,
That's so not true. Like I can, separate my life. And then when I started to have kids and I had more than one child, I realized how true her statement was, because
mhm.
a lot of your life, your social life, your extracurriculars, it revolves around your kid's schedule, and you
Yeah,
lose yourself in some ways, and making sure to keep that time to be you and to still,
right.
water those loves and passions and hobbies that you have is so important, especially someone in the nonprofit sector who's living through passion and their passion, but sometimes it gets stale and there's sometimes negative experiences, and being able to turn to something that you're going to either get a positive feedback from or is totally unrelated and you can just center on yourself is so important.
Mhm. I see this all the time in the nonprofit world where, your friends become colleagues and, you operate in the same space. Like they're very blurred lines with your personal life, your work life, especially when you're the founder and the passion and you surround yourself around other people that are also passionate about these things. And it certainly becomes all consuming. It's something to be really mindful of. So this has been given a lot of food for thought. I'm taking away that first things first to scale a business, I think, is to take a hard inventory, come up with a plan, think about the two things that you said, well, three things really that you said today that really stuck out to me. Focus on fundraising has to be important. Um, Focus on kind of all other things like business operational, especially the finances and understanding what's happening there, and do a lot of self-reflection and think about what role do you play in this? At what point does it make sense maybe to transition, either doing this full time, or maybe it means transitioning out completely, or passing the baton on to someone else or something like this. If people want to get in touch with you to know or expand on these few things as part of their plan, you described a plan, but I think people might be interested to hear, well, what more should go in the plan? Like specifically, people talk about a plan in a vague sense, like what else should I be considering there? If they want to connect with you or Tiff on the work that you're doing to help lay this out for your clients, what would be the best way to get in touch with you? How would people connect?
Sure. Probably the best way is through our website, which is
Okay.
www.executivearm.org.
Okay.
But you can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Instagram.
Okay.
We're pretty available. The one tricky thing about our name is when you type executive arm in Google, you get the executive branch of the United States of America.
Oh,
Isn't
not to be
us,
confused. Not
not
to
to
be
be
confused.
confused. But if you go to executivearm.org, you'll find us. And
Okay.
we're available. You can send in, our phone numbers are there, or you can send us an email. And we're pretty available. So feel free to contact us if we can help.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, thank you again for spending your day with us and sharing some of your words of wisdom and lessons learned and sharing the lessons learned of other founders. For anybody listening, you know the drill. If you found any of this information useful, please engage with it in some way. It allows other nonprofit leaders like yourself to find the content. That's just the way the algorithms work on the internet. Until next time, thank you all for joining us. That's all we have for you today. Once again, I'm Tosha Anderson with the Charity CFO, and this is a Modern Nonprofit Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to a Modern Nonprofit Podcast on all major streaming platforms so you will stay notified for when the latest episode drops, which will help you stay in the know about anything nonprofit related. Also, join our community on Facebook by searching for a Modern Nonprofit Podcast and follow us on all of our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.